Cop abuses power on black woman, then realizes she's his boss. What happens next changes everything. Meet Officer Napoleon Oscar, a seasoned cop who prides himself on knowing how to keep order, until one unexpected encounter turns his entire approach upside down. When he questions Olivia Bertha, a calm and confident black woman in the park, he assumes she's just another stranger needing a reminder of the rules. But Olivia isn't just anyone. She's actually his superior, Captain Bertha, and she's about to teach him one of the most powerful lessons of his career. If this is your first time here on our channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our amazing stories. Now, let's jump into the full story. Officer Napoleon Oscar adjusted his cap and stepped out of his patrol car, his gaze sweeping over the rows of trees and benches that dotted the park. It was a quiet day, the kind that made his job seem almost too easy. But in Napoleon's experience, stillness was often an illusion, and he believed vigilance was the key to keeping order. As he strolled along the path, his hand instinctively brushed against the radio at his side. The park had become a popular spot recently, drawing people from various parts of the city. However, with the influx of visitors came a rise in small incidents: graffiti, littering, the occasional petty theft. Napoleon felt a personal responsibility to maintain peace here, so he took a particular interest in the park's activity. He knew every corner and every hidden spot and, by now, had grown familiar with most of the regulars who frequented it. As he continued his patrol, he noticed a woman seated alone on one of the benches, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. She was a bit older than most visitors, with a calm presence that seemed at odds with the bustling families and joggers passing by. Dressed in casual attire, her shoulders squared and posture alert, she exuded a quiet confidence. Yet, something about her seemed off to him. There was a sense of familiarity in her stance, but he couldn't quite place it. He squinted, his mind racing through the countless faces he encountered daily. No, he didn't recognize her specifically, but his instincts pricked, a feeling he had come to trust over his years on the force. He had learned to identify people who didn't quite fit in or who appear to be hiding something. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, approaching her with a deliberate pace. The woman looked up, meeting his eyes without a hint of fear or discomfort. Her calm gaze only made him feel more uneasy. "Yes, officer," she asked politely, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Napoleon cleared his throat. "I don't mean to disturb you, but I couldn't help noticing you sitting here alone. Are you waiting for someone?" The woman's smile widened. "No, I'm just enjoying the park. Is there a problem, officer?" Napoleon studied her, trying to read between the lines. "Not necessarily. It's just unusual to see someone sitting alone in this area for long. We've had reports of suspicious activity recently, so I like to keep an eye out." "Of course," she nodded understandingly. "I appreciate your dedication to keeping this place safe." Her words sounded sincere, yet Napoleon couldn't shake his growing suspicion. Was she mocking him? There was an air of familiarity in her tone, almost as if she knew him, or knew what he was trying to do. His defenses rose. "Do you mind showing me some ID, ma'am?" he asked, his voice laced with formality. She raised an eyebrow but nodded, reaching into her bag to retrieve her wallet. Her movements were calm, controlled, and she handed him her ID with steady hands. "Here you go." Napoleon glanced down at the ID, quickly scanning her name. Olivia Bertha. It didn't ring any bells, yet something nagged at him. He handed it back, his suspicion barely subdued. "Thank you, Miss Bertha." "So, you live around here?" he asked, attempting to probe further without seeming overtly intrusive. Olivia chuckled softly, a sound that only fueled his irritation. "Not quite, officer, but I've spent my fair share of time in places like this." "Is that so?" he replied, his tone sharpening unintentionally. "Yes," she said, meeting his gaze head-on. "I've made it my mission to protect spaces like these. Actually," the response caught him off guard, but he quickly masked his reaction. "That's admirable." As they continued their exchange, a subtle shift in her demeanor made him pause. Olivia was holding back, he realized, something hidden beneath her polite smile and steady gaze. Napoleon struggled to shake the feeling that there was more to this woman than met the eye. His instincts, finely honed through years of dealing with all manner of people, told him she wasn't just a random visitor. Yet, despite his every attempt to assert control over the conversation, Olivia Bertha remained unruffled, almost as if she had foreseen his every question. "So," he said, feeling a prickling discomfort, "you're saying you have some kind of official role around here?" Olivia's eyes sparkled with a glint of amusement. "Something like that," she replied cryptically, her smile unwavering. Napoleon's suspicion deepened. Normally, people grew nervous or defensive when questioned. They fidgeted, avoided eye contact, stumbled over their words. But Olivia wasn't like any of them. Instead, she met his gaze with a calm assurance that was both frustrating and, dare he admit it, intimidating. "Well, Ms. Bertha," he continued, determined not to be thrown off, "it would help if you were a bit more specific. What exactly do you do?" Olivia regarded him for a moment, as if weighing her response. "Let's just say I'm very familiar with law enforcement and leave it at that." Napoleon clenched his jaw. He felt like he was being toyed with, and it irritated him. She was an ordinary woman, sitting on a park bench. What authority could she possibly have? Yet, something in her voice carried an unmistakable weight. Deciding not to let her sidestep his authority, he pushed further. "Are you refusing to answer, Ms. Bertha?" he asked, keeping his tone stern. Her smile softened, almost sympathetically. "Not at all, Officer Oscar. I simply believe that, given your position, you'll find out soon enough." The subtle challenge in her words sent a wave of irritation through him, but he fought to remain professional. "Ms. Bertha, if you're withholding information, it could be considered obstruction," he warned, hoping to get a reaction. To his surprise, Olivia didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back on the bench, her arms resting comfortably at her sides. "Officer, I assure you, there's no obstruction here," she replied, a calm authority in her voice that rivaled his own. "But if you truly feel I'm out of line, perhaps you should take this up with my superiors." Her statement stunned him into silence. Superiors? For the first time, doubt seeped into his mind. He glanced at her again, this time with a new lens, trying to piece together the puzzle of this enigmatic woman who seemed entirely unfazed by his authority. The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Napoleon found himself studying Olivia with renewed intensity, trying to decipher the layers of meaning behind her calm words and steady demeanor. She was confident, too confident for a civilian under questioning by a uniformed officer. "Ms. Bertha," he started, choosing his words carefully, "I'd like to know exactly what you mean by superiors. If you're involved with law enforcement, it's in everyone's best interest to be clear about it." Olivia's smile didn't waver, but there was a shift in her expression, something that hinted at an inner amusement, as though she was watching him puzzle out a truth that was right in front of him. "Officer Oscar, I think you may be taking this a bit more seriously than necessary. I'm not here to interfere with your duties." "Taking it seriously?" Napoleon echoed, feeling his frustration mount. "I'm just doing my job, Ms. Bertha, ensuring that no one is disrupting public peace." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Olivia was the furthest thing from disruptive. In fact, she sat so quietly and confidently it unsettled him more than any loud protest or defiant attitude ever could. Olivia crossed one leg over the other, settling in as if she had all the time in the world. "I completely respect that, officer," she said smoothly, her tone professional yet somehow piercing. "But let me offer you a bit of advice. Sometimes appearances aren't what they seem, and it's crucial for any law enforcement officer to see beyond what's on the surface." Napoleon felt a wave of irritation mixed with a strange pang of doubt. Was she hinting at something he hadn't yet figured out? Her tone carried a weight he couldn't ignore, like she knew something essential he was missing. "Is that a threat, Miss Bertha?" he asked, masking his unease with firmness. She chuckled softly. "Not a threat at all. Just guidance from someone who's walked a similar path." She glanced at him, her eyes sharp. "And it's Captain Bertha, by the way." The realization struck him like a punch. Captain? The word echoed in his mind as he scrambled to process it. Suddenly, her calm demeanor, her authoritative presence, her composed responses, All of it fell into place. "Captain Bertha?" he repeated, almost incredulously. She nodded, her expression both understanding and unyielding. "Yes, Officer Oscar. I'm your superior within the force." She gave him a moment to absorb the truth, watching as his face transitioned from confusion to disbelief. Napoleon's pulse quickened as the weight of Olivia's words settled over him. This was no stranger. This was Captain Olivia Bertha, a superior officer within his own department. The realization washed over him, stripping away his confidence and leaving him with a raw, exposed feeling. He had never encountered her in uniform, but he had heard whispers about Captain Bertha, her reputation for being sharp, fair, and unyielding. His mind raced, replaying every word he'd said, every doubt he'd expressed. Embarrassment swelled within him, turning his face hot. He had treated her like an ordinary suspect, questioning her presence, pushing her for information, and all along, she had simply been observing him. Taking a deep breath, Napoleon stiffened, attempting to recover his professionalism. "Captain Bertha," he finally managed, his voice tight. "I apologize for my tone and assumptions. I didn't recognize you." Olivia tilted her head slightly, studying him with an unreadable expression. "Officer Oscar, do you realize how critical it is for us to question our instincts and assumptions?" she asked gently, though there was an edge in her tone. "Our job isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about knowing when to apply it with empathy and discernment." He nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, unable to meet her gaze fully. The lesson she was imparting stung, but he knew it came from a place of wisdom. She wasn't chastising him, at least not in the traditional sense, yet her words held a heavy reminder of his duty. "Every individual we encounter deserves respect until proven otherwise," Olivia continued, her gaze unwavering. "A uniform and a badge don't grant us power over others. They grant us responsibility. Sometimes, the authority we carry can blind us if we're not careful." The reminder hit home. He had acted out of assumption, letting his authority cloud his judgment and his view of her. "You're right, Captain," he admitted, his voice low. "I let my suspicion get the best of me." Olivia gave him a small nod, acknowledging his honesty. "Thank you for your openness, officer. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. That's a strength, not a weakness." Her words, though firm, carried a subtle warmth that surprised him. He felt the initial sting of embarrassment fade, replaced by a resolve to learn from this encounter. She stood, her expression softening just slightly. "I'm glad we had this conversation, Officer Oscar. Remember, there's always more to people than what we see. Keep that in mind." With a final nod, she walked away, leaving Napoleon to contemplate her words and the humbling encounter that would stay with him long after she was gone. As Captain Bertha disappeared down the path, Napoleon remained rooted in place, replaying the encounter over and over in his mind. Her words lingered, echoing with a clarity that pierced through his pride and left him feeling exposed. He had often prided himself on his ability to read people, to make quick assessments that kept the streets safe. But today, he realized he had mistaken authority for insight. Feeling the weight of his badge more heavily than usual, Napoleon began to walk, his steps slow and thoughtful. The park that once felt familiar now seemed layered with hidden meanings and silent lessons. He couldn't help but think of the people he had encountered over the years, faces he had dismissed, suspects he had scrutinized, assumptions he had made without second thought. A pang of guilt settled in his chest. Had he judged them as quickly and unfairly as he had judged Captain Bertha? The question gnawed at him, stirring a discomfort he could no longer ignore. He had seen countless individuals simply as profiles, cases to be solved, threats to be neutralized. Yet, Olivia's calm demeanor and quiet authority reminded him that every face held a story he couldn't know at a glance. Determined to learn from the experience, Napoleon found a quiet bench in the park and sat down, his mind focused on understanding where he'd gone wrong. His instincts were supposed to be an asset, but when did they begin clouding his judgment instead of sharpening it? When had suspicion become his default setting? The memories of his early days in the academy surfaced, where they were taught not only skills but values, patience, respect, discernment. Back then, he'd been idealistic, seeing the role of an officer as one of service and compassion. But years of street experience had hardened him, made him wary, perhaps even cynical. He took a deep breath, resolving to reconnect with the core values that had drawn him to law enforcement in the first place. Captain Bertha's words had struck a nerve, but perhaps it was what he needed to shake him awake. He couldn't change the past encounters he had mishandled, but he could certainly change his approach from this day forward. As he stood up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose, he caught sight of his own reflection in a nearby fountain. In it, he saw both the officer he was and the one he hoped to become. With a nod to himself, Napoleon set off, resolved to do better, not just for the people he served, but for himself. The following morning, Napoleon entered the precinct with a heightened awareness, a subtle shift in his perspective that felt both invigorating and humbling. As he stepped into the familiar hustle of officers preparing for their shifts, he noticed details he hadn't paid attention to before. The expressions on his colleagues' faces, the quiet chatter in the hallways, and the nuances in the way people greeted each other. He spotted his partner, Officer Carla Ruiz, near the coffee machine. She was scrolling through her phone, an eyebrow raised in mild frustration. Normally, he would have brushed past her, focused on his own pre-shift routine, but today he paused. "Hey, Carla," he greeted, his tone softer than usual. "Everything all right?" She glanced up, surprised by his question. "Yeah, just another argument with my kid over her schoolwork," she sighed, shaking her head. "Teenagers, you know?" Napoleon chuckled, nodding. "I hear they're a handful. Let me know if you need a break to deal with it. I can cover for you." Carla gave him a look of appreciation, her frustration easing a bit. "Thanks, Nap. I might take you up on that." As they moved to the briefing room, Napoleon noticed himself viewing everyone through a different lens, taking time to understand rather than simply observe. It felt strange at first, almost vulnerable, but he embraced it, reminding himself of Captain Bertha's words about empathy and looking beyond the surface. Captain Bertha's arrival at the precinct was as understated as the woman herself. She entered quietly, her presence commanding without needing fanfare. Napoleon watched her move through the room, nodding to officers, greeting each one with genuine familiarity. He could see now why people respected her so deeply. Her authority was rooted not in her rank, but in her ability to connect and understand. As she approached him, Napoleon felt a twinge of anxiety. Would she mention yesterday? Acknowledge the lesson she had imparted? "Officer Oscar," she greeted with a nod, her expression calm but perceptive. "I trust today finds you well?" "Yes, Captain," he replied, meeting her gaze. "Thank you. I appreciate yesterday." She nodded, her expression softening. "I could tell, officer. It's part of the journey, learning and unlearning what we think we know. Remember, the badge you wear represents more than authority. It represents trust." Her words resonated deeply, a reminder of the duty he had signed up for. "I won't forget that, Captain. Thank you for the reminder." As she moved on, Napoleon felt a renewed determination settle within him. This time, it wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about serving people, protecting the vulnerable, and holding himself accountable. Napoleon left the precinct that day with a clearer sense of purpose, eager to put his newfound perspective into action. As he drove through the city streets, he felt the weight of his responsibility in a different way, more as a commitment than a burden. His route took him to the downtown district, an area bustling with activity and frequented by diverse communities, each with their own stories, struggles, and dreams. Pulling up to a familiar intersection, he noticed a small crowd gathered outside a corner store. The owner, a middle-aged man named Tarek, often called the precinct to report minor disturbances, usually involving neighborhood youth hanging around his store. Today, though, Napoleon decided to approach with caution, careful not to jump to conclusions. He parked his cruiser and approached the group, taking in the tense faces around him. At the center stood a teenage boy, visibly upset and holding a skateboard, while Tarek gestured animatedly, clearly frustrated. "Hey, Officer Oscar," Tarek called as Napoleon neared, relief evident on his face. "This kid here has been loitering outside my shop all afternoon, blocking my customers." I asked him to leave several times, but he wouldn't budge. The teenager, whose name was Jerome based on his backpack tag, rolled his eyes but remained silent. Napoleon looked at him, recalling Olivia's words. Every individual we encounter deserves respect until proven otherwise. He felt a shift inside him, a reminder to treat this encounter differently. All right, let's all take a breath, Napoleon said calmly. He turned to the boy. Jerome, is it? Can you tell me what's going on? Jerome shifted uncomfortably, glancing away. I'm just waiting for my friend to get out of work. I wasn't trying to bother anyone, just needed somewhere to wait. Napoleon nodded, understanding. Okay, that makes sense. But can you see how it might look to someone else if you're hanging out here without explaining that? Jerome shrugged, his defenses softening slightly. I guess yeah, maybe. Turning to Tarek, Napoleon said, Tarek, I know you're trying to keep your shop safe, but sometimes things aren't what they seem. Jerome here just needs a place to wait. Maybe we can find a compromise. Tarek hesitated, then sighed. Fine, as long as he doesn't block my door. Napoleon nodded, giving Jerome a reassuring look. Just make sure you stay to the side, all right? Jerome gave a slight nod, visibly relieved. Thanks, officer. As Napoleon walked back to his cruiser, he felt a quiet pride. He had handled the situation differently, seeking understanding before control. It was a small moment, but for Napoleon, it was the beginning of a new approach, one he hoped would define his career from that day forward. Later that evening, Napoleon sat in the precinct's break room, his mind replaying the scene with Jerome and Tarek. It had been a small incident, the kind of minor disturbance he might have brushed off or handled with a quick reprimand before. Yet, his approach had been different this time, more deliberate, more open to seeing the full picture. He felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't experienced in years. As he sipped his coffee, his partner Carla entered, dropping into the chair across from him with a tired sigh. Long day? He asked, noting the exhaustion in her eyes. She nodded, stretching her arms. It's the usual, she replied, taking a deep breath. But I heard you handled things a bit differently downtown today. Saw Tarek when I stopped by for lunch. He actually thanked me for sending someone who knew how to handle troublemakers with understanding. Napoleon couldn't help but laugh, a bit surprised that word had gotten around so quickly. Just trying a new approach, he admitted, slightly embarrassed by the attention. Turns out a little patience goes a long way. Carla's eyes softened, a trace of admiration evident. You know, Nap, I think that's exactly what we need more of around here. It's easy to get caught up in control, but understanding, that takes a little more effort. She paused, then added, maybe we could all learn from that. Her words struck a chord, and Napoleon realized that his actions had already begun to have an impact. If Carla and others noticed, maybe change could start from within, shifting the precinct's culture one interaction at a time. He remembered Captain Bertha's words, the badge represents trust. He wanted to be someone worthy of that trust, not just in the eyes of the public, but also among his peers. Just then, a call came over the radio. A disturbance had been reported near a community center, involving a group of teenagers. Carla stood up, grabbing her gear. Looks like we're up again, she said, giving him a nod. Napoleon followed her, a quiet determination settling within him. As they approached the community center, he braced himself for what lay ahead, reminding himself of his recent lessons. He would listen first, observe with an open mind, and aim to de-escalate rather than control. When they arrived, a group of teens lingered near the entrance, laughing and talking loudly. A concerned bystander explained that they had been disruptive, playing loud music and bothering passers-by. Instead of approaching with a reprimand, Napoleon addressed them calmly, introducing himself and asking them about their evening. The teens seemed surprised, exchanging glances before responding. Within minutes, he'd learned their names, understood why they were there, and arranged a respectful agreement to keep the noise down. As he and Carla left, she gave him an approving nod. Not bad, Officer Oscar, she said with a grin. Napoleon smiled back, feeling the ripple effect of his new approach. The next morning, Napoleon arrived at the precinct with a renewed sense of purpose, eager to see if he could carry this new approach into the everyday rhythm of his work. His interactions with Tarek, Jerome, And the teens at the community center had not only altered how he felt about his role, but had also sparked subtle changes in how his colleagues viewed him. As he walked in, he caught snippets of conversation among the officers. Carla waved him over, a knowing smile on her face. "You're becoming a bit of a celebrity around here, Nap," she teased. "People are talking about how you handled things yesterday. With patience, no less." Napoleon chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess I'm developing a reputation I didn't see coming." "It's a good thing," she said, nodding approvingly. "We're out there to serve, after all. Sometimes we forget that listening and understanding are part of the job." Napoleon knew she was right. He had been so focused on maintaining control and authority that he had lost sight of the deeper purpose of his work. Hearing his colleagues acknowledge this change filled him with a renewed commitment to the path he was forging. Later, as he sat at his desk reviewing his schedule, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning around, he found Captain Bertha standing behind him, her expression warm but serious. She gestured to a quiet corner of the precinct, indicating she wanted to speak privately. They moved away from the others, and Captain Bertha crossed her arms, studying him thoughtfully. "I've been hearing about the approach you've been taking lately, Officer Oscar," she began. "It seems you've taken our conversation to heart." He nodded, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, ma'am. I realized I was letting my assumptions cloud my judgment, treating people as problems to be solved instead of individuals to be understood." Captain Bertha's gaze softened, and a hint of pride flickered in her eyes. "That's a powerful realization. It's not easy to reflect on our own flaws, let alone make changes based on that reflection. But change within a precinct doesn't start from a policy. It starts from individuals who care enough to make a difference." Napoleon felt a surge of gratitude. Her encouragement validated his efforts and solidified his resolve to continue down this path. He could see now that Captain Bertha was not only a mentor but someone who believed in fostering meaningful change within the force. "Thank you, Captain," he replied, his voice earnest. "I won't forget what I've learned." She nodded, a rare smile breaking her otherwise composed demeanor. "Good. Keep up the work, Officer Oscar. You might just inspire others to follow suit." As she walked away, Napoleon felt an undeniable sense of pride. Not the pride of authority, but the pride of knowing he was doing the right thing, one interaction at a time. Napoleon was still processing his conversation with Captain Bertha when he was called into Lieutenant Green's office. Lieutenant Green was known for his no-nonsense approach, a commanding presence who held the precinct together with a firm hand. Napoleon respected him deeply, and he was surprised to be summoned out of the blue. He knocked on the door and entered. Lieutenant Green gestured for him to take a seat, his expression unreadable. "Oscar," he began, leaning back in his chair, "I've been hearing a lot about your recent work in the field. Word travels fast around here, and it sounds like you're making some adjustments." Napoleon nodded, a little uncertain about where this was going. "Yes, sir. I've been trying a new approach, one focused on listening first, finding common ground before assuming the worst." Green raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk appearing. "Captain Bertha has had a word with you, I assume?" "Yes, sir. She opened my eyes to a few things," Napoleon admitted, choosing his words carefully. Lieutenant Green regarded him for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "Good. Bertha knows what she's talking about, and frankly, we could use more of that around here. I think this precinct has been too quick to jump to conclusions, especially in the field. A fresh perspective might just be what we need." Napoleon felt a surge of pride, but tried to stay composed. "Thank you, sir. I'm glad to be making a positive impact." Green leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "Oscar, I'm going to give you an assignment. I've got a few rookies coming in over the next few weeks. I want you to mentor them, show them the ropes, but also guide them on how to connect with the community. Make them see people, not profiles." The request surprised Napoleon. He hadn't considered himself a mentor, but the idea of passing on what he'd recently learned was appealing. "I'd be honored, sir," he replied sincerely. "I'll do my best to guide them." Green gave a single nod, a look of satisfaction crossing his face. "Good. Let them learn from someone who's still learning himself. That's often the best teacher." As Napoleon left the office, a sense of purpose filled him. The idea of mentoring young officers was both exciting and daunting. He remembered what it felt like to be new, full of enthusiasm but unsure of how to navigate the complexities of the job. The rookies would likely come in eager to make arrests and assert their authority, just as he had once been. It would be his job to remind them of the deeper purpose behind the badge. Reflecting on this new responsibility, he felt a renewed sense of accountability, not just to himself, but to the new generation of officers who would carry the precinct's legacy. He resolved to pass on the lessons he had learned, hoping to cultivate a culture of patience, respect, and true service. The following week, Napoleon found himself standing in the training room with three newly minted officers, Ethan, Maya, and Jamal. They were eager, sharp-eyed, and clearly nervous, glancing at him with the kind of respect mixed with apprehension that he remembered feeling himself not so long ago. He could see their enthusiasm brimming just beneath the surface, the same excitement he'd once felt to jump into action and make a difference. "Welcome to the team," Napoleon started, offering them a nod of encouragement. "I know you're all ready to hit the streets and do your job, but I want to start with a bit of advice. Being an officer isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about connecting with people and understanding the stories behind every face you encounter." The rookies exchanged curious looks, and Ethan spoke up. "So, are you saying we shouldn't be too quick to make arrests?" Napoleon smiled, remembering his own initial impatience for action. "Exactly. Don't get me wrong, there are times when swift action is necessary. But in many cases, if you take a moment to listen, to observe, you'll find a solution that doesn't always require force." Maya, the smallest of the group, but with a fierce determination in her eyes, tilted her head thoughtfully. "So you're saying it's about empathy?" Napoleon nodded, pleased by her insight. "Yes, empathy and patience. We're here to protect, but we're also here to serve. Sometimes, serving means stepping back, seeing the whole picture, and respecting the person in front of you." Jamal, quiet until now, raised a hand. "Have you always worked this way?" The question made Napoleon pause, a humbling reminder of his journey. "No," he admitted. "I used to think authority was my most valuable tool, but recently, I learned that respect and understanding are just as powerful, and they build trust." The rookies seemed to absorb this, their expressions a mix of contemplation and resolve. Napoleon felt a sense of pride and responsibility, knowing that he was helping to shape their first experiences. If he could pass on even a fraction of what he had learned, he knew they'd become the kind of officers who truly made a difference. Later that day, Napoleon took the rookies out for their first patrol, guiding them through the bustling streets of the downtown district. The city pulsed with its usual energy, people shopping, vendors selling their goods, kids playing on the sidewalk. Napoleon could see the rookies taking everything in, their eyes wide with the newness of it all. As they walked, a commotion broke out near a small grocery store. A middle-aged woman, clearly distressed, was yelling at a teenage boy who stood with his head down, clutching a small bag of groceries. "Hey, that's mine. He didn't pay for it," she cried, waving her hands in frustration. Instinctively, Ethan took a step forward, his hand moving toward his radio. But Napoleon held up a hand, signaling him to wait. He approached the woman, Maya, Jamal, and Ethan close behind. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Oscar," he said calmly. "Can you tell us what happened?" The woman took a shaky breath. "He took that bag of food and just walked out. I don't have money to lose like this." Napoleon turned to the boy, who looked up with a mixture of fear and shame. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Marcus," the boy muttered, barely meeting his eyes. I'm sorry. I just needed some food." The rookies watched, visibly surprised at the young boy's response. Napoleon could sense their initial urge to jump to conclusions shifting as they saw the situation from a different angle. "Why didn't you ask for help, Marcus?" Napoleon continued, his tone compassionate. The boy shrugged, his voice barely audible. "Didn't think anyone would care." Napoleon looked at the woman, who now seemed less angry and more understanding. "Ma'am, would you be willing to let this slide if Marcus agreed to work off what he owes?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I'd be okay with that." Napoleon turned back to Marcus, who nodded eagerly, grateful for the chance. As they walked away, the rookies looked at Napoleon with newfound respect. "See," he said, meeting their eyes. "Not every problem needs force. Sometimes, all it takes is a bit of understanding." The rookies were visibly impacted by the encounter with Marcus, the experience leaving them thoughtful as they continued their patrol. Napoleon could see their initial assumptions shifting, a gradual understanding taking root as they began to see situations in shades of gray rather than black and white. As they rounded a corner, Maya spoke up, her voice reflective. "I think I would have handled that differently if I was on my own." It's easy to jump to conclusions when all you see is a confrontation. Napoleon nodded, giving her an encouraging look. "And that's completely normal. Most people's first instinct is to restore order, but order doesn't always come from control. Sometimes, it comes from listening." Jamal nodded thoughtfully. "You showed us that in both cases today. But what about when someone isn't open to talking? Like if the woman had demanded we arrest Marcus?" Napoleon considered this, appreciating Jamal's insight. There will be times when people aren't willing to compromise or see another side, and we'll have to make hard calls. But even then, our job is to de-escalate as much as possible, to ensure that we're not adding to the chaos. Ethan, who had been quiet, spoke up. "It's like, we're supposed to be more than just law enforcers. We're community members, too." Napoleon smiled, pleased with their reflections. "Exactly. The community needs to see us as allies, not just authority figures. Trust isn't given. It's earned through consistent respect and empathy." Just then, a call came over the radio about a disturbance at a local bus stop involving two men arguing loudly. Napoleon signaled to the rookies, and they made their way over. When they arrived, they found the two men in a heated exchange, with passers-by glancing over nervously. Napoleon motioned for the rookies to stay back, observing. Approaching with a calm demeanor, Napoleon placed himself between the men, speaking in a low, steady tone. "Gentlemen, let's take a breath. What seems to be the issue here?" The men paused, their anger easing slightly. As they each explained their side, Napoleon listened patiently, giving each one a chance to speak. By the time they were finished, the tension had dissipated, and Napoleon had helped them reach a simple compromise. He turned back to the rookies, nodding. "Sometimes, all people want is to be heard." As the day wore on, Napoleon and the rookies continued their patrol, encountering a range of everyday situations that required their attention. The rookies were becoming more comfortable, even showing glimpses of the compassion and patience Napoleon had hoped to instill. But he knew that their journey would be full of challenges, and not every interaction would go as smoothly as the ones they'd experienced so far. In the late afternoon, a call came through about a noise complaint at a nearby apartment complex. Neighbors had reported a resident playing music at full blast, refusing to turn it down despite multiple requests. Napoleon knew this situation would be trickier. Noise complaints were often met with anger and defensiveness, especially when people felt their personal space was threatened. As they approached the apartment, loud music pulsed through the hallway, and Napoleon could feel the rookies tensing up beside him. He gave them a reassuring nod before knocking firmly on the door. After a moment, the door swung open to reveal a man in his mid-40s, his eyes narrowing as he saw the uniforms. "What do you want?" he demanded, his tone hostile. "Sir, we received a noise complaint," Napoleon began calmly. "Some of your neighbors are having trouble with the volume of your music. Would you mind turning it down a bit?" The man crossed his arms, a defiant look on his face. "This is my apartment. I can play my music as loud as I want." Napoleon remained unfazed, nodding with understanding. "I get it. You're in your own space, and you have every right to enjoy your home. But your neighbors are also entitled to a peaceful environment. If we can find a middle ground, no one has to feel like they're being inconvenienced." The man's expression softened slightly, though he still looked skeptical. After a few seconds, he sighed. "Fine. I'll turn it down a little." "Thank you," Napoleon replied, giving a small, respectful nod. As they walked back down the hall, Maya whispered, "I thought for sure he'd refuse. How'd you stay so calm?" Napoleon smiled. "People usually mirror what they're shown. If we approach with respect, we're more likely to get it back, even if it takes a moment." As the sun began to set, Napoleon and the rookies made their way back toward the precinct. They had just wrapped up their patrol, and the day had been filled with learning moments that had opened the rookies' eyes to the complexities of policing. Napoleon could see the reflection of those lessons in their thoughtful expressions. However, just as they were nearing the station, they noticed a figure stumbling out of a small convenience store nearby. The man was young, disheveled, and clutching his stomach, his face contorted with pain. Napoleon recognized him instantly. It was Jerome, the teenager from the park who had been waiting for his friend a few days before. Napoleon's instincts kicked in as he quickly approached Jerome, motioning for the rookies to stay back but keep watch. "Jerome, what happened?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with concern. Jerome looked up, clearly embarrassed but also in pain. I messed up, officer," he muttered. "Some guys jumped me, took my wallet." Napoleon knelt down to meet his gaze, keeping his voice gentle. "Do you know who they were?" Jerome hesitated, glancing away before muttering, "Yeah, some guys from my neighborhood. They told me to pay up for some stuff I didn't even buy, and when I refused, they beat me up." Maya, watching from a few steps away, looked visibly affected, and Napoleon could tell she wanted to step in. He gave her a nod, signaling her to approach. She crouched beside him, offering Jerome a small, reassuring smile. "Jerome, do you need medical help? We can get you to a clinic," Maya offered, her tone kind. Jerome shook his head. "Nah, I'll be fine. I just didn't know where else to go." Napoleon placed a hand on Jerome's shoulder. "You did the right thing coming here. Let's help you sort this out and get you somewhere safe. You don't have to handle this alone." For the rookies, especially Maya, the encounter was a stark reminder of why empathy and patience mattered. They weren't just dealing with criminals and suspects. They were dealing with people, each with their own struggles. As they helped Jerome back to the precinct, the rookies saw firsthand how policing could extend beyond the badge, offering protection and support to those who needed it most. Back at the precinct, Napoleon found an empty bench in the lobby where Jerome could sit while they sorted things out. The rookies followed closely, their expressions a mix of concern and determination. Maya handed Jerome a bottle of water, her earlier confidence replaced by a gentleness Napoleon hadn't seen before. Lieutenant Green happened to be passing by and paused, raising an eyebrow at the group. "Oscar, what's going on here?" Napoleon straightened, gesturing to Jerome. "Sir, this is Jerome. He was attacked by a few men in his neighborhood who demanded money from him. We're looking to get him somewhere safe and report the incident." Green nodded, studying Jerome with a thoughtful expression. "Good work, Oscar. Let's make sure he feels secure." "Jerome, you're in good hands here." The lieutenant's reassurance seemed to ease Jerome's nerves, and Napoleon could see him relax, the tension in his shoulders softening. The rookies watched as Lieutenant Green walked away, leaving them to continue handling the situation. "Jerome," Napoleon said, crouching down to eye level with him, "do you have someone we can call? A family member or friend?" Jerome shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his hands. "My mom's at work, and I don't want to worry her." Napoleon nodded, understanding. "All right, well, you're welcome to stay here until you feel ready to go home. We'll make sure you're safe." Jamal stepped forward, surprising Napoleon by gently offering, "And if you need someone to walk you home, I can go with you. No one should have to deal with this alone." Jerome looked up, a glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks. That means a lot." Napoleon watched the rookies, their earlier curiosity now deepened into a genuine desire to help. He realized that they were learning something more important than any policy or procedure. They were understanding what it meant to protect with compassion and serve with respect. As Jerome settled, Napoleon turned to the rookies, giving them a proud nod. "This," he said quietly, "is the kind of impact we aim for. Policing isn't just about stopping crime. It's about being there when someone needs support." For the rookies, this experience became a pivotal moment, shaping how they would approach their duty, not just as officers, but as people who understood the power of trust. Later that evening, after Jerome had safely left the precinct, Napoleon gathered the rookies for a debriefing. They sat around a small table in the break room, the energy in the room subdued yet thoughtful. Napoleon could see that the events of the day had affected each of them, and he wanted to make sure they understood the significance of what they had experienced. Today was a bit different from what you might have expected when you joined the force, Napoleon began, his tone gentle but serious. Policing isn't just about enforcing the law, it's about building connections, being a source of stability for people who don't always have it. Maya nodded, her expression contemplative. I always thought of this job as being black and white, like following rules and making arrests. But it's so much more human than I expected. Napoleon smiled, appreciating her honesty. Exactly. Rules are important, but sometimes people need to see that behind the badge, we're human, too. That's what builds trust and keeps our communities strong. Jamal leaned forward, his voice soft. When Jerome looked at us for help, I realized just how vulnerable people feel when they come to us. They're scared, and they're putting their trust in us, hoping we'll do the right thing. Napoleon nodded, a sense of pride swelling within him. Yes, Jamal, and that trust is something we have to honor. Every single day, Ethan, who had been quiet for most of the day, spoke up, his voice tinged with a new sense of purpose. I think I've been focusing too much on authority and not enough on responsibility. Today made me see that this job is as much about helping people as it is about keeping order. Napoleon took a deep breath, grateful for the growth he saw in each of them. Remember that, all of you. We're here to make a difference, not just in the way we keep the peace, but in the way we show up for people who need us. As they wrapped up, Napoleon felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew he was shaping the rookies into compassionate officers who would carry these lessons forward. And for the first time in his career, he felt that he was truly making a lasting impact. The following week, as Napoleon was wrapping up paperwork in his office, he received a surprising visitor. Jerome stood at the precinct's front desk, shifting nervously from one foot to the other, holding a small brown paper bag. One of the rookies, Maya, had spotted him and brought him over. "Officer Oscar," she said with a smile, "you have a visitor." Napoleon looked up, his eyebrows lifting in pleasant surprise. "Jerome, good to see you. Everything all right?" Jerome nodded, looking a bit shy but also determined. "Yeah, everything's good. I just wanted to say thanks for everything." Napoleon stood, walking over to greet him. "You're always welcome here, Jerome. I'm glad we could help." Jerome held up the bag, extending it to Napoleon. "I brought something. It's not much, but it's my way of saying thanks." Napoleon accepted the bag, peeking inside to find a few homemade cookies wrapped in napkins. The simple gesture touched him deeply. "Thank you, Jerome. This means a lot," he said warmly, feeling the sincerity of the gesture. The rookies, who had gathered around out of curiosity, watched the exchange with softened expressions. It was a reminder that small moments of kindness had the power to ripple out, leaving a lasting impact. As Jerome prepared to leave, Maya spoke up. "Jerome, it was really brave of you to come here. Not everyone would do that." Jerome gave her a small, appreciative smile. "I was scared, but you all made me feel safe. And that's not something I feel very often." The rookies looked at Napoleon, silently acknowledging the difference he had made in Jerome's life, and in their own understanding of what it meant to serve as officers. After Jerome left, Napoleon turned to the rookies. "People don't always say thank you in this line of work, and that's okay. But when they do, remember that it's not about the cookies or the words. It's about knowing that you made someone's life just a little bit better." In that moment, Napoleon felt something shift within the precinct. His approach and the lessons he'd passed on were starting to reshape the culture around him, and it was a change he knew would outlast any badge or title. The positive energy from Jerome's visit lingered in the precinct. It seemed that Napoleon's approach had not only affected the rookies, but had also sparked a ripple throughout the department. Officers began to approach situations with a bit more patience, a bit more empathy. It was subtle but undeniable. A few days later, Napoleon was called into Lieutenant Green's office once again. He entered, half expecting a discussion on the new cases piling up, but instead, Lieutenant Green stood up, extending his hand. "Napoleon," he began, a rare smile crossing his usually stern face, "I wanted to acknowledge the work you've been doing. I've noticed changes in the rookies, and it's clear they're learning from your example. Napoleon shook his hand, feeling a wave of gratitude. Thank you, sir. It's been a different way of approaching things, but I think it's making a difference. Green nodded, motioning for Napoleon to take a seat. I'll be honest. When I first heard about the changes you were making, I was skeptical. But seeing how the rookies are responding, and even how the other officers have started to shift their approach, has proven me wrong. Napoleon smiled, humbled by the acknowledgement. I'm just trying to live up to the badge in a way that feels right. Captain Bertha gave me some guidance, and I realized I needed to look at this role differently. Green leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Well, I think it's a perspective we could all benefit from. I want to propose something, a formal mentorship role for you. You'd work with new recruits, not just in procedures, but in the values you've demonstrated. Compassion, empathy, respect. Napoleon's eyes widened, surprised by the offer. I'd be honored, sir. I think it's a way to build stronger connections between us and the community. Green gave a nod of approval. Good. I'll start making arrangements. In the meantime, keep doing what you're doing. Leaving Green's office, Napoleon felt a mix of pride and purpose. The recognition wasn't just a career milestone. It was a validation of his commitment to meaningful change. He knew he was on the right path, not only as an officer but as a mentor, shaping a new generation of officers who would carry forward these values. The following weeks solidified Napoleon's new role as a mentor within the precinct. Word spread about the fresh approach he was imparting to new recruits, an approach grounded in patience, empathy, and respect. Officers, both seasoned and new, began to seek him out, curious to learn the methods that were shifting the dynamic between law enforcement and the community. Napoleon took to his role with humility, constantly reminding himself of the journey that had brought him here. From a young officer eager to prove his authority to a mentor focused on building trust and compassion, he carried Captain Bertha's words with him, knowing they had been the spark that set him on this path. Her quiet strength and insight had reshaped not just his career but the entire precinct. One afternoon, Captain Bertha stopped by his office. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a rare, genuine smile softening her usual serious expression. "Napoleon," she said, her tone warm, "you've done more than I could have hoped for. The precinct feels different, and I can't think of anyone better suited to lead these rookies." He met her gaze, feeling the depth of her words. "Thank you, Captain. You're the reason I started thinking differently. I owe a lot of this to you." She shook her head gently. "I may have given you a nudge, but you did the work. This change? That's all you, Napoleon." As she left, Napoleon took a moment to absorb her words, a deep sense of fulfillment settling over him. He had found a purpose within his role, something greater than enforcing laws. He had found a way to serve and to inspire others to see the badge as a symbol of hope rather than authority. One of the rookies, Maya, knocked on his door a few minutes later, her face lit with excitement. "Officer Oscar, I thought you'd like to know." Jerome stopped by. He wanted to thank everyone, and he said he's even thinking of volunteering at a local youth center. Napoleon's heart swelled with pride. Jerome's growth and gratitude were testaments to the small but meaningful impact that empathy could make. As he walked out of his office to watch the rookies prepare for another patrol, Napoleon felt a profound sense of legacy in his work. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a chance to shape a community and change lives, starting with the officers around him. For the first time, he truly understood the weight and honor of wearing the badge. It wasn't about control or power. It was about trust, compassion, and the responsibility to uplift those he served. He was no longer just Officer Oscar. He was a mentor, a guide, and a symbol of a better future for his precinct and his community. And as he watched Maya, Jamal, and Ethan leave the station, eager and ready to serve, Napoleon knew that his story would live on through them, a legacy of kindness, understanding, and hope.